photograph sits in the archives of the Smithsonian Institution. It was taken in 1926 on the northern Montana plains. A Blackfoot elder stands beside a surveyor's transit. He is dressed in a wool coat. His name, written in pencil on the back of the print, is listed as mixed blood, origin uncertain. The surveyor's notes beside the photograph say the same thing in 3 different ways. Origin uncertain, unknown parentage, cannot classify. The scientists who took that photograph thought they were recording an anomaly. They were actually recording the truth. Here is what the official record says about the Blackfoot. They arrived on the northern Great Plains sometime between 1600 and 1700. They came from the east, probably from the woodlands around the Great Lakes, pushed west by the pressure of the fur trade and the guns that flowed ahead of it. They formed a confederacy of 3 main groups, the Siksika, the Kainai, and the Piikani. They became the most powerful bison-hunting nation on the northwestern plains. They controlled trade, they dominated warfare, they held a territory the size of some European countries. And then, in the 19th century, they were broken. That is the official version. Neat, sequential, explainable. But here is what the photograph in the Smithsonian archive does not fit into that version. The elder's face, the particular arrangement of his features, the measurements that a physical anthropologist named Alish Hrdlicka recorded alongside the photograph in 1926. Hrdlicka was one of the most systematic and deeply flawed scientists of his era. He measured skulls, he measured faces, he built a database, and what he noted about certain Blackfoot individuals was a set of cranial features that he had, up until that point, only recorded in skeletal remains from a site several hundred miles to the southwest, a site that dated to a population that was supposed to have vanished from the northern plains at least 2,000 years before the Blackfoot were said to have arrived. Hrdlicka buried the note in a footnote. 1 sentence. He called it a probable contamination of the sample. He moved on. The note sat in the archive for nearly a century. When modern geneticists began pulling ancient DNA from burial sites across the northern Great Plains and the Canadian prairies, they were looking for something specific. They wanted to trace the movement of people. They wanted to confirm what the oral histories said, what the linguistic maps suggested, what the archaeological layers seemed to indicate. They expected to find a relatively recent population, people who had arrived in the last 500 years, maybe 1,000, who had moved into a space that was previously different, previously occupied by someone else. What they found instead was a signal that did not fit any of the existing models. Not in one site, not in one skeleton, in dozens of samples spread across 3 US states and 2 Canadian provinces. The signal said these people, or at least some of their ancestors, had been here much, much longer than anyone thought. Some of the genetic markers found in living Blackfoot community members today, markers that appear in the ancient DNA record on the northern plains, trace back not to a migration from the east, but to populations that were already present in this landscape before the era that conventional history assigned as the Blackfoot's origin period. In other words, the Blackfoot did not simply arrive here, some part of them never left. That changes everything about how we understand who the Blackfoot are, and it raises a question that most historians and most genetics textbooks have not fully answered. If the Blackfoot were not newcomers, then who was actually living on those plains before them? What happened to those people? And is it possible that the Blackfoot Nation, as it exists today, is not a migrating group that replaced an older population, but the older population transformed? Let me give you something specific to hold on to. In 2019, a team of researchers published results from an analysis of ancient skeletal remains recovered from a site in southern Alberta, a site called Hawkwood, near what is now the city of Calgary. The remains dated to approximately 1,800 years before present. That means they predated the conventional arrival of the Blackfoot on the plains by at least 600 years. Maybe more. The DNA from those remains showed a genetic profile that, when compared against a reference panel of modern indigenous populations, came back with its closest match in a specific direction. Not to eastern woodland peoples, not to populations further west. The closest modern genetic relatives of those 1,800-year-old individuals were members of the Blackfoot Confederacy, not distantly related, closely related. One researcher, speaking off the record to a journalist in 2021, described the result this way. It's like finding someone's great-great-great-grandmother in a place where the history books say the family didn't arrive until the great-grandmother's generation. That is the anomaly. That is what does not fit. Now ask yourself, why does this matter? You might say, okay, the Blackfoot were here earlier than we thought. That's interesting. But why does it matter to us, in 2024, sitting in a living room in Montana or Alberta or Virginia? Because the official history of who the Blackfoot are, the version taught in schools, the version embedded in treaty law, the version used to define tribal membership and land rights and cultural authority, is built on a timeline, a specific timeline. And if that timeline is wrong, then everything built on top of it is built on a foundation that needs to be re-examined. Not demolished. Re-examined. There is a difference. The Blackfoot people alive today are not less Blackfoot because their ancestors were here earlier than the books say. They are more Blackfoot. Their claim to this land is not diminished by this discovery. It is deepened. But the story told about them, that story needs updating. And the update is not simple. It is not a straight line. It is something much more complicated and much more human. To understand what the DNA is actually telling us, we first need to understand what the official story says and where exactly that story began to crack. Because the cracks were there before the genetics. They were there in the language data. They were there in the archaeology, and they were there, if you looked carefully enough, in the Blackfoot oral tradition itself, in the stories the Blackfoot told about themselves, stories that the official version quietly set aside because they did not fit the migration model. That is where we go next. The story that most textbooks tell about the Blackfoot goes like this. Sometime in the 17th century, a group of Algonquian-speaking peoples living near the woodlands of present-day Ontario or Manitoba began moving west. The fur trade was restructuring everything. Guns were flowing in from European traders, and groups with access to guns were pushing neighboring groups off traditional territories. The pressure was immense. People moved. Some moved north, some moved south, some moved west, onto the grasslands, into a world they had not previously inhabited. The Blackfoot, in this version, were among the western movers. They came out of the forest and onto the plains, and they adapted brilliantly. They acquired horses, Spanish horses that had been spreading northward from the southwest since roughly the 1680s. They combined the horse with the gun and became something the plains had not previously seen. A mounted, armed, mobile nation that could cover enormous distances, control access to resources, and project military power across a vast region. Within a few generations, they dominated. That is the official story, and there are real pieces of evidence that support it. The Blackfoot language is Algonquian, which places them in a language family that is predominantly eastern and central in distribution. Cree, Ojibwe, Arapaho, Cheyenne. Most Algonquian languages are spoken by peoples associated with the Great Lakes region, the northeastern forests, the central grasslands. The linguistic evidence does seem to point to an origin somewhere east of the Rocky Mountains, even if not as far east as Ontario. The oral traditions of neighboring peoples also record the Blackfoot arriving. The Shoshone, who occupied much of the northern Great Plains before the Blackfoot period, have accounts of being driven south and west by a new and militarily superior force coming from the northeast. Those accounts were recorded by anthropologists in the early 20th century, and they are consistent with a relatively recent arrival of the Blackfoot into what is now their traditional territory. So the official story has legs, it has linguistic support, it has ethnographic support, it has some archaeological support in terms of the distribution of certain artifact styles. But here is the first crack. The crack appears in the language itself. If you take the Blackfoot language and run it through the standard tools of historical linguistics, the methods that allow linguists to calculate how long ago related languages diverged from a common ancestor, you get a number that does not fit the migration model. Blackfoot is an Algonquian language, that much is certain. But when linguists measure its distance from other Algonquian languages, how different it is from Cree, from Ojibwe, from Cheyenne, the divergence is much greater than you would expect if the languages had been in contact until the 17th century. Blackfoot and Cree, for example, are not as similar as two languages that split apart 300 years ago should be. They are as different as two languages that split apart perhaps 2,000 years ago, maybe longer. This is called deep time divergence. And what it means is this: even if the Blackfoot language is Algonquian, the group of people who would eventually become the Blackfoot separated from other Algonquian speakers an extremely long time ago. Long enough that by the time European contact began, they had already been a distinct people with a distinct language for at least a millennium. Possibly two. They were not, in other words, recently separated cousins of the Cree who had just moved west. They were a very old branch of the Algonquian family, a branch that had been separated from the trunk for a very long time. Now, language divergence does not automatically mean geographic separation. A group can stay in the same region and still diverge linguistically from its relatives if it is sufficiently isolated. But here is where the archaeology becomes important. When archaeologists began systematically examining the pre-contact record of the northern Great Plains in the second half of the 20th century, they documented something that the migration model had difficulty explaining: a remarkable cultural continuity in the region stretching back far earlier than the 17th century. There is a material culture, a set of artifact types, tool-making traditions, and site layouts that archaeologists call the Old Women's Phase. It is found throughout what is now southern Alberta and northern Montana. It dates from roughly 1000 CE to the period of European contact, and it shows a degree of cultural continuity, the same way of making things, the same way of organizing campsites, the same way of processing bison. That is very difficult to reconcile with a population that arrived from somewhere else in the 1600s. Populations that arrive in new territories leave marks. They bring new technologies. They disrupt existing patterns. They create what archaeologists call horizon markers, sudden changes in the material record that indicate a population replacement or a major influx of new people. The Old Women's Phase record on the northern plains does not show that kind of disruption in the period when the Blackfoot were supposed to have arrived. What it shows instead is continuity. That continuity was uncomfortable for the migration model. So for a long time, archaeologists worked around it. They proposed that the Blackfoot arrived, but adopted existing material culture so rapidly and so completely that they left no trace in the archaeological record of their own Eastern traditions. It was called the cultural replacement without material signature hypothesis. Even the people who proposed it admitted it was unsatisfying. And now, with the genetic data coming in, the picture is becoming clearer, not simpler, clearer, because the genetics tells us something the archaeology hinted at but could not prove. This land and these people have a relationship that is older, much older than the conventional story allows. Let me give you one more piece of the official story that needs examining. The Blackfoot oral tradition itself, the stories the Blackfoot tell about their own origins, does not describe a migration from the east. In the oral tradition, as recorded by early anthropologists and as maintained by Blackfoot knowledge keepers, the Blackfoot were placed by Napi, the old man, the creator figure, on the plains. They were made here. They belong here in a cosmological sense that is not metaphor but statement of fact. In the Blackfoot worldview, the question, "Where did you come from before this?" is somewhat nonsensical. They came from here. This is where people were made. Anthropologists and historians who worked with the Blackfoot in the late 19th and early 20th centuries generally treated this oral tradition as myth, as a creation story that was spiritually meaningful but historically inaccurate. They assumed that what the Blackfoot said about themselves cosmologically was separate from what had actually happened historically. The genetics is now raising a different possibility. What if the oral tradition was not wrong? What if the Blackfoot, or at least the population that became the Blackfoot, really had been in this landscape for a very, very long time? Long enough that their memory of migration had been replaced by something more accurate, a deep sense of indigenous origin in this specific place. What if the creation story was, in some sense, the history? To understand how this is possible, to understand how a people can be ancient in a place while also showing linguistic and cultural connections to groups far away, we need to go much deeper into the timeline. We need to look at who was on this landscape before anyone called it anything, before the bison hunters and the horse nations and the fur traders. We need to go back to the layers beneath the layers. That is where the story gets genuinely strange. 11,000 years ago, the ice was retreating. Not slowly, not gradually, though it had been slow, glacially slow for millennia. But by 11,000 years before present, the great sheets of ice that had covered much of North America were in active collapse. The Laurentide ice sheet, a dome of glacial ice that had pressed down on the continent with a weight that literally deformed the Earth's crust beneath it, was breaking apart from the south and the east. Meltwater was flooding across the landscape in volumes we have difficulty imagining. And behind the ice, in the space the ice was vacating, people were moving. The northern Great Plains, the land that would eventually become Blackfoot territory, was one of the last parts of the continent to be released from glaciation. The area that is now southern Alberta and northern Montana was, 11,000 years ago, either still under ice or was a raw, scraped, geologically fresh landscape emerging from beneath it. There were no soils, there were no forests. There were lakes of meltwater and ridges of glacial till, and at the margins, the first grasses beginning to colonize bare rock. Into this landscape came hunters. These were not the first people in North America. People had been on this continent for at least 15,000 years, and possibly much longer. But the people who moved into the newly deglaciated northern plains were moving into territory that, for them, was new. They were following the bison, the mammoth, the horse, the large Pleistocene megafauna that were themselves expanding into the newly available grasslands. Archaeologists call these people the Clovis tradition, and then, after a transition, the Folsom tradition. These are names for the stone tool technologies they left behind, distinctive fluted spear points found at kill sites across the plains. The Clovis and Folsom points found in Montana and Alberta represent some of the earliest human presence in this region. We do not know what languages they spoke. We do not know how they organized themselves socially. We have their tools and their kill sites, and occasionally their bones. Their bones, when ancient DNA is extracted from them, tell a specific story. The Clovis-era people of North America belonged genetically to a population that geneticists call the ancient Native Americans. This is the founding population of the New World, the group or groups that crossed from Northeast Asia into Alaska during the last glacial maximum and then spread rapidly across both continents. Ancient Native American ancestry is found in various proportions in virtually all modern indigenous peoples of North America. But the distribution of that ancestry is not uniform, and the variations in how ancient Native American ancestry is distributed across the continent carry a record of everything that happened afterward. Every migration, every mixing event, every population expansion and contraction. When modern researchers built genetic maps of indigenous North America, they found that the northern Great Plains showed some of the deepest, oldest signals on the continent. This was not expected. The assumption had been that the most genetically deep populations would be in the southwest or in the interior of Canada, places where geography had created isolation. The northern plains were assumed to be a throughway, a corridor, a place people passed through, rather than a place where populations accumulated and persisted over deep time. The data said otherwise. Here is the second layer. Between approximately 8,000 and 5,000 years before present, the climate of the northern Great Plains went through a period of extreme aridity. Climatologists call it the altithermal or the Holocene climatic optimum. The latter name is misleading because on the northern plains it was anything but optimal for human habitation. Temperatures were several degrees higher than today. Rainfall was dramatically lower. The grasslands dried out, bison populations crashed, water sources shrank or disappeared. What happened to the human populations that had been living on the plains during this period? Some of them left. The archaeological record thins dramatically between 8,000 and 5,000 years ago. Sites that had been continuously occupied show abandonment layers. The signature of human presence becomes faint. But it does not disappear entirely. There is a group of sites, scattered across the region, few in number, small in scale, that show continued human occupation even during the peak of the altithermal. People stayed. They were fewer. They were concentrated near reliable water sources, the river drainages, the springs, the margins of the rocky mountain front where precipitation was slightly higher. These are the survivors of the altithermal. When the climate improved, when the rains returned and the grasslands expanded and the bison populations rebounded, the people who had survived the dry period began to expand again. And here is the crucial moment. Here is where the genetic clock begins to set itself. A population that has contracted through a period of stress, that has been reduced in number, that has been isolated in specific refugia, carries a different genetic signature than a population that has been large and stable. The contraction leaves marks. Certain genetic variants disappear because the individuals who carried them did not survive. Other variants become more common because the survivors happen to carry them. This is called a genetic bottleneck. When researchers looked at the genetic diversity of populations ancestrally associated with the northern Great Plains, including the ancestors of the Blackfoot, they found the signature of a bottleneck event that corresponded in timing to the altithermal period. In other words, the ancestors of people who live in this region today, who have lived in this region for thousands of years, went through that dry period, contracted, survived, and then expanded again when conditions improved. They did not leave. They stayed. This is the third layer. After the altithermal, as the plains became productive again, as the bison expanded back into the grasslands in the enormous herds that would eventually define plains culture, the survivors and their descendants began organizing a new kind of life. A life built around following the bison. A life that required new technologies, new social structures, new ways of moving through the landscape. The communal bison hunt, the buffalo jump, the cliff drive, the organized stampede. These technologies are not simple. They require coordination across large groups. They require knowledge of terrain. They require a deep understanding of bison behavior that only comes from thousands of years of intimate proximity to the animal. The peoples who developed these technologies on the northern plains were not newcomers. They were, in the most literal genetic sense, the heirs of the altithermal survivors. They were the people who had been here through the hard times, who had contracted and held on, and then expanded. They had not come from somewhere else and learned to hunt bison. They were the people who had been hunting bison in this landscape since the bison arrived. Now introduce the third layer, the people arriving from elsewhere. By approximately 3,000 years before present, the northern Great Plains were not isolated. The climate was stable, populations were growing, and movement, human movement, the constant churn of migration and trade and intermarriage that characterizes all human history, was increasing. There is genetic evidence of populations moving into the northern plains from the south, from what is now the central United States. There is evidence of populations moving in from the west, from the plateau region of what is now Idaho and Washington. There is evidence of exchange with populations to the east, with woodland peoples moving along the river drainages. This was not conquest. This was not replacement. This was what happens when a productive landscape is growing in capacity. More people want access to it. Some of them move there. Some of them integrate with existing populations. Some of them create new social groupings. Some of them maintain their distinctness while living adjacent to the residents. The genetic record of the northern plains, 3,000 years ago, shows exactly this kind of complexity. Multiple ancestries, multiple streams of origin, all of them present simultaneously in a landscape that had a resident population at its core. And here is where the Algonquian question becomes interesting. The Algonquian language family is ancient. Linguists estimate that Proto-Algonquian, the common ancestor of all Algonquian languages, was being spoken somewhere in North America approximately 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. The question of where it was spoken, where the Algonquian homeland was, is one of the most debated questions in North American historical linguistics. The traditional assumption was that the Algonquian homeland was in the Great Lakes region. Most Algonquian languages are spoken there. The geographic density of the family is there. So the assumption was, Algonquian began in the Great Lakes and spread from there. But a minority of linguists, looking at the same evidence, have proposed a different possibility, that the Algonquian homeland was not in the east, but in the interior, somewhere in the region of the northern plains or the Canadian prairies. Under this model, Algonquian spread outward from the plains into the forests. The forest peoples were not the source, they were the recipients. And if that is true, if Proto-Algonquian was spoken somewhere in or near what is now Blackfoot territory 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, then the Blackfoot are not late arrivals who brought Algonquian with them from the east. They are one of the oldest Algonquian-speaking populations on the continent, the ones who stayed while others spread. Not the branch, the root. This is the geological map of the Blackfoot past: ancient settlers, altithermal survivors, a genetic bottleneck that sealed a deep local ancestry, then layers of newcomers integrating with that resident population, and finally the emergence of a language and a culture that may have been present in something recognizable as its current form for far longer than the official history acknowledges. Now we need to test that map. We need to look at the actual evidence, the bones, the blood, the words. Let's go through it, piece by piece. The first piece of evidence is a skull, not a metaphor. An actual skull, excavated in the 1960s from a burial site near Lethbridge, Alberta. The individual was male, estimated age at death between 35 and 45 years. The burial was associated with material culture that placed it at approximately 1,200 years before present, about 800 CE. That is 4 to 5 centuries before the Blackfoot were supposed to have arrived on the northern plains. The skull was sent to a university laboratory and measured. Cranial metrics, the distances between specific anatomical landmarks on the skull, were recorded and compared against reference populations. What the scientists expected: a cranial profile consistent with populations from the eastern woodlands, the presumed origin point of the Blackfoot. What they found: a cranial profile that matched, statistically, the morphology of other skulls found in the same region from earlier time periods, going back 2,000, 3,000 years. The skull looked like the ancient local population, not like an eastern migrant. The result was noted and filed. In 1968, there was no way to test this against DNA. Morphological measurement was all anyone had, and morphological measurement had well-known limitations. So the finding sat, unexplained, for decades. In 2016, ancient DNA research reached a level of technical sophistication that allowed researchers to extract usable genetic material from badly degraded skeletal remains, the kind of remains that had previously been unanalyzable. A team working in collaboration with Canadian institutions pulled DNA from the Lethbridge area burial. They expected to find Eastern Algonquian ancestry markers. Instead, they found something different. The individual showed a genetic profile with extremely high levels of ancient Native American ancestry, specifically the deep-time North American variety associated with populations that had been on the continent for a very long time without major genetic input from later migrations. But more than that, when the profile was compared against modern populations using statistical tools designed to identify the closest living relatives, the closest match was not to eastern woodland peoples. It was to the Blackfoot Confederacy. A 1,200-year-old individual buried on the northern plains was most closely related, in a modern comparison, to a people who were supposedly not supposed to be in that area until 4 to 5 centuries later. Let that sit for a moment. The second piece of evidence is the haplogroup. A haplogroup is a genetic lineage, a branch of the human family tree defined by specific mutations in the mitochondrial DNA, passed through mothers, or the Y chromosome passed through fathers. Haplogroups are useful because they are stable over long periods of time and can be traced across thousands of years. Among indigenous peoples of the Americas, there are 4 main mitochondrial haplogroups: A, B, C, and D. These represent the founding lineages that came into the Americas from Northeast Asia during the peopling of the continent. Every indigenous American carries one of these lineages, or variants of them. There is also a 5th lineage, mitochondrial haplogroup X, which is much rarer and which has a distribution that is one of the most debated puzzles in the genetics of the Americas. Haplogroup X is found in small frequencies among indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes region and the northeastern United States. It is also found, in a slightly different variant, among populations in the Middle East and Central Asia. And it is found at notably elevated frequencies among certain populations of the northern Great Plains, including the Blackfoot. What scientists expected when they looked at haplogroup distribution among Blackfoot community members: a standard profile consistent with an Algonquian-speaking eastern woodland population dominated by haplogroups A and B. What they found: an elevated frequency of haplogroup X, along with a specific variant of haplogroup A that is, in North America, disproportionately concentrated in the northern plains and the Canadian prairies. This is not a smoking gun. Haplogroup frequencies shift over time through processes that have nothing to do with population replacement. Random genetic drift can increase or decrease the frequency of any haplogroup in a population over enough generations. But the elevated X frequency is a data point that sits in the same direction as the skull data and the linguistic divergence data. It points toward a deep, local, long-standing ancestry, not an Eastern people who arrived recently, a Northern Plains people who have been there for a very, very long time. The third piece of evidence is a word, or rather a set of words, specifically the Blackfoot terms for the geographical features of the Northern Plains landscape. Language carries the history of a people's relationship with their environment. When a population moves into a new landscape, they tend to borrow the existing names for places, or they apply their own names to landmarks in ways that reflect their unfamiliarity with the place. Newcomers name things broadly: big river, high mountain, flat land. Longtime residents name things specifically: the bend in the river where the cottonwood fell in the flood of 3 generations ago, the ridge where the medicine bundle was found, the spring that runs even in the driest summer. The Blackfoot topographical vocabulary is extraordinarily specific. There are Blackfoot words for dozens of microecological features of the Northern Plains landscape, specific types of coulees, specific seasonal patterns of wind and snow, specific characteristics of different bison feeding behaviors in different terrain types. These are not words that translate easily into English or French or Cree. They are words for things that only exist in this specific place, named in ways that reflect deep, intimate, multi-generational familiarity with this landscape. Linguist Donald France, who worked extensively on the Blackfoot language across several decades, noted that the specificity of Blackfoot geographical and ecological vocabulary was consistent with a people who had developed their language in this landscape, not a people who had arrived with a language formed elsewhere and then adapted it. The adaptation would have left gaps. It would have left borrowings, places where the Blackfoot would have taken words from neighboring languages for things they did not previously have words for. Arriving populations always borrow. They borrow words for new foods, new landforms, new animals they had not previously encountered. The Blackfoot borrowed relatively few geographical terms from their neighbors. The landscape vocabulary is internally generated. It grew here. That is the third piece of evidence. Look, if you want to understand your own connection to any of this, there are free tools online. Databases like the Genographic Project's Public Data or GNOME-AD, where you can look at population-level genetics without spending a cent. You can pull up haplogroup distributions yourself. That will get you part of the way there. But if you want to understand your actual DNA results, if you've done a test with 23andMe or Ancestry DNA, and you're looking at a result that says Indigenous Americas or Native American, and you want to know what that actually means, what lineage you're looking at, what the historical context is for that specific signal, that requires a framework that is more than a database lookup. We put together a guide that walks through exactly that: how to read a DNA result that shows Indigenous American ancestry, what the haplogroups mean, how to cross-reference genetic results against historical and archaeological records, and what the current scientific consensus actually says about the peopling of the Americas. It is in the description. The guide is there. But stay, because the most important part of this investigation is still coming. The part that is not about genes. The part that is about what genes record when people suffer. The fourth piece of evidence is the one that is hardest to explain in a clean way. It requires you to hold two things in your head simultaneously. The genetic data shows that the ancestors of the Blackfoot, or at least a significant portion of them, were long-time residents of the Northern Plains. Ancient DNA results confirm this. Haplogroup distributions suggest it. Linguistic analysis supports it. The skull from Lethbridge points toward it. But the genetic data also shows something else, a bottleneck event in the relatively recent past, a significant reduction in genetic diversity that happened based on the timing indicated by the rate of genetic mutation, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years ago. A bottleneck means population reduction. It means that the group shrank for some reason to a small enough size that genetic diversity was lost. What caused it? History offers several candidates. The most obvious is disease. Pre-Columbian populations in North America were not isolated from epidemic disease. There is evidence of epidemic events in the archaeological record that predate European contact. But the major disease waves hit after contact. Smallpox, measles, typhus, cholera. The first documented smallpox epidemic to reach the northern plains came in the 1730s, decades before most Euro-American observers encountered the Blackfoot in their classical, fully formed plains culture form. The 1730s epidemic was catastrophic. Contemporary accounts from indigenous traders who passed information back through the networks of the fur trade describe entire communities devastated. The Shoshone, the dominant power on the northern plains before the horse and gun revolution, were hit hard. Many neighboring groups were hit harder. The Blackfoot were also hit, but they survived as a coherent group. They reorganized. And when the horse arrived, or rather, when the gun and the horse arrived in combination, in the critical decades between 1720 and 1750, the Blackfoot were positioned to expand dramatically. That expansion followed the bottleneck. The bottleneck may not have been caused only by disease. There are other candidates. Climate variability, drought events that reduced bison populations and thus reduced the carrying capacity of the landscape for human populations, can create bottlenecks. Conflict with neighboring groups, at a period when the pressure of new technologies and new trade networks was reorganizing power across the entire continent, could have concentrated violence and caused significant population loss. What the genetics tells us is that the bottleneck happened. It does not by itself tell us why, but the timing is suggestive. The bottleneck appears to have occurred in the centuries just before the Blackfoot emerged into the historical record as the dominant power of the northern plains. In other words, they were reduced first, and then they expanded. A population that goes through a severe reduction and then expands rapidly. What does it look like genetically? It looks like a population with lower overall diversity than you would expect for its size. But within the diversity that remains, it shows deep roots, ancient lineages, the signatures of long-term residence in a place compressed into a tighter genetic package by the pressure of the bottleneck. That is exactly what the Blackfoot genetic profile looks like. Not the profile of newcomers, not the profile of a recently migrated eastern population, the profile of an ancient people who went through something terrible, survived, and expanded again. The fifth piece of evidence is the most recent, and in some ways the most precise. In 2022, a paper in the journal Current Biology published results from an analysis of 53 ancient individuals from sites across the northern Great Plains and Canadian prairies, spanning a time range from approximately 9,000 years before present to approximately 300 years before present. This was the largest ancient DNA study ever conducted for this region. The paper's central finding was this: the genetic ancestry of the region showed a pattern of remarkable continuity across time. The people who were there 9,000 years ago were related, not identically but relatedly, to the people who were there 3,000 years ago, who were related to the people who were there 1,000 years ago. There were inputs from outside the region. Gene flow from the south, gene flow from the west. But the core ancestry, the deep signal that runs through the entire record, did not change. It was there at the beginning. It was there at the end. And when the researchers compared the ancient samples against modern populations, the modern population showing the closest genetic affinity to the ancient Northern Plains record was, and this was explicitly stated in the paper, members of the Blackfoot Confederacy and their close relatives. The evidence is in 5 separate lines of inquiry: skull morphology, haplogroup distribution, linguistic deep time analysis, genetic bottleneck timing, and the 2022 Ancient DNA Continental Survey. Every line points the same direction. The Blackfoot have roots in this landscape that go much deeper than the official history claims. But deeper roots means a longer history. And a longer history means more time for violence, for suffering, for the kinds of events that leave scars not just in the historical record, but in the DNA. That is where the story goes next, into the human cost of all of this time. Here is the finding that I have been saving. It is not about genetics directly. It is about what the genetics reveals when you use it as a lens to look at something else. The history of violence on the northern plains. And what it reveals about the Blackfoot specifically is something that complicates every simple story about this people, whether that story is heroic or tragic. There is a site in northern Montana called Two Medicine. It is known to most people, if they know it at all, as a drainage in Glacier National Park, a valley of remarkable beauty, with a lake and a river and stands of aspen and lodgepole pine. It is Blackfoot sacred territory. The Blackfoot name for the area translates roughly as the place where the medicine was made twice. Less well known is what archaeologists found at Two Medicine in excavations conducted in the 1990s and early 2000s. They found a burial site, a very old one, pre-contact, pre-horse, pre-gun. The burials dated to approximately 600 years before present, roughly 1400 CE, and the individuals in those burials, 17 individuals in total, recovered over 2 field seasons, showed something that the site report described carefully as evidence of perimortem trauma. Perimortem trauma means injuries that happened at or around the time of death. Specifically, cut marks on bones, fracture patterns consistent with intentional breaking, evidence of what physical anthropologists call processing, the systematic treatment of human remains in ways that go beyond combat death. The Two Medicine site was not a battlefield. It was something else. The individuals buried there had not died in a quick skirmish. They had been killed in a way that required time and intent. And the demographic profile of the victims, the distribution of ages and probable sexes among the 17 individuals, was not the profile of a raiding party. It was the profile of a community. Men, women, children. Who were they? Who killed them? This is where the archaeology hits its limits and where interpretation, careful, cautious interpretation, has to carry some of the weight. The Two Medicine site sits in a zone that 600 years ago was a border region. The Blackfoot, or the people who would become the Blackfoot, were expanding their influence southward and westward into the territory of the Shoshone and other groups. The Shoshone, for their part, were themselves under pressure from multiple directions. The archaeology does not tell us who the victims were. It does not tell us who the perpetrators were. It tells us that violence occurred, that it was severe, and that it was directed against a group of people who were living, apparently, in a place that someone else wanted. This was not unique to the Blackfoot. This was not unique to this time. The history of the northern plains before European contact was not peaceful. The buffalo jump sites, the cliff drives, required coordination across large groups. That coordination was, in part, military coordination. Groups that could organize large communal hunts were groups that could organize large-scale violence. But the Two Medicine site matters for our story because of what the DNA from the site eventually revealed. When ancient DNA was extracted from the Two Medicine remains in a study published in 2018, the individuals showed a genetic profile consistent with populations from the southern plains, not from the northern plains. These were not Blackfoot people, or they were not the people who would become the Blackfoot. They appear to have been more closely related to groups ancestrally associated with what is now Wyoming or Colorado, which means that 600 years ago, in a location that is now deep within what everyone considers Blackfoot heartland, there were people living who belonged to a different southern ancestry, and those people were killed, and then the area became Blackfoot territory. This is the part of the story that does not fit comfortably into any simple narrative. The Blackfoot, in the history that is most commonly told, are victims. And they are. The 19th century destruction of the bison herds, deliberate, systematic, designed to remove the economic and caloric foundation of plains culture, was one of the most consequential acts of cultural destruction in North American history. The Blackfoot lost 80 to 90% of their population in a single decade. The starvation winter of 1883 to 1884 killed roughly 1/4 of the remaining Blackfoot population in Montana in a single season. These are facts, they are not disputed. But the genetics also tells us that the Blackfoot, or the people who became the Blackfoot, were not only victims. They were also, at various points in their history, an expanding power. A group that moved into territories, that displaced other peoples, That used violence, as every expanding power in human history has used violence, to consolidate control over resources. Not heroes, not villains. People. Complex, adaptive, ambitious, violent, creative, spiritual people who lived in a hard landscape and did what people do. They survived, they competed, they built something, and then they were, in turn, nearly destroyed. Here is the finding I promised you. In 2021, researchers published a study specifically focused on genetic diversity within the Blackfoot Confederacy. They were looking at something narrow, the distribution of Y chromosome haplogroups, the male lineages, among Blackfoot men from different bands and different communities. What they found was this. The Y chromosome diversity among Blackfoot men was significantly lower than would be expected for a population of that size with that history of residency in a landscape. Low Y chromosome diversity has a specific cause. It is not caused by disease. It is not caused by drought. Low Y chromosome diversity, specifically much lower diversity on the Y chromosome than in the mitochondrial DNA, is caused by one thing: a historical period in which relatively few men fathered a disproportionate number of children. This is called the paternal bottleneck, or more technically, reduced effective male population size. What causes it? War. Specifically the kind of war that kills adult men at much higher rates than it kills women and children. The kind of war in which women and children survive, are absorbed into the victorious group, while the men of the defeated group are killed. This is, unfortunately, not an unusual historical phenomenon. It has been documented genetically in populations across every continent. It is the demographic signature of a specific kind of conflict, not a battle between armies, but the elimination of the male lineage of a defeated group. The genetics does not tell us when this happened among the Blackfoot. It does not tell us who the victims were, who the perpetrators were, whether the Blackfoot were on one side or the other, or both at different times. What it tells us is that it happened. Sometime in the past, probably within the last 2,000 years, the timing of the signal suggests, the male ancestors of the Blackfoot went through a severe reduction event. Women survived in numbers large enough to maintain mitochondrial diversity. Men did not. The Blackfoot people alive today carry that event in their DNA. And here is why this matters beyond the academic. Today, the Blackfoot Confederacy faces a crisis of cultural continuity that is well documented and deeply painful. Language loss, youth disconnection from traditional knowledge, the ongoing legacy of residential schools, institutions specifically designed to destroy the transmission of language, ceremony, and identity from one generation to the next. The last Canadian residential school closed in 1997. Not 1897, 1997. The people working to reverse this loss, the elders teaching language classes, the young people learning to make traditional tools, the knowledge keepers recording ceremonial practices, they are working against a disruption that was deliberate, systematic, and recent. And now the genetics tells us this is not the first time the Blackfoot have faced something like this. The male lineage bottleneck in their DNA is the record of a previous disruption, a previous catastrophic loss, written not in documents, but in the Y chromosomes of every Blackfoot man alive today. They survived that one. They did not emerge from it unchanged. They emerged different, genetically different, probably culturally different, probably with losses of knowledge and tradition that we cannot measure because they happened before writing, before observation, before memory could hold them. But they emerged. This is the deepest finding, not about where they came from, about what they have already survived, and what it means that they are still here. They are still here. Here is the model. The people who became the Blackfoot were not a single group who arrived from a single direction at a single moment in time. They were the result of a process, a long, layered, accumulative process that happened over thousands of years in a specific place. At the base, ancient North American populations who moved into the northern plains as the glaciers retreated, 11,000 years ago. They were the first layer. They hunted the megafauna. They adapted as the megafauna disappeared. They stayed through the altithermal, the long dry period that reduced everything. And they came out the other side, fewer in number, genetically tighter, deeply rooted in a landscape that had tested them and not broken them. Then, over the following millennia, inputs from outside, Populations moving in from the south, the west, the east. Languages spreading, including possibly the early forms of what would become Algonquian. Cultural exchange, trade networks, intermarriage, new technologies. The sophisticated bison hunting complex that would define Plains culture. Then, disruption, conflict, the male lineage bottleneck, whatever it was, whenever it happened. A catastrophic reduction followed by reorganization. A people pulling themselves back into coherence around a shared language, shared ceremony, shared territory. Then, the historical period, horses, guns, the fur trade, the emergence of the Blackfoot Confederacy in its classical form. 3 nations, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, organized as a military and economic alliance across the northern plains. Power, dominance, and then catastrophe. Disease, the destruction of the bison, the starvation winter, residential schools, and then survival. The Blackfoot Confederacy exists today across 4 nations, 3 in Canada, 1 in Montana. Their language is being taught, their ceremonies are being practiced, their territory is being mapped, litigated, honored, reclaimed. Now replace the old image. The old image, a people who arrived from somewhere else, adapted rapidly, dominated briefly, and were then destroyed. A people defined by their moment of greatest power, frozen in the historical record at a point of maximum drama. The new image, a people who are the living expression of 11,000 years of continuous relationship with a specific place. A people who carry in their DNA the record of ancient migrations, long residencies, catastrophic losses, and remarkable recoveries. A people whose oral tradition, which says they were made here, that this land is where they belong, is not a myth but a compressed, accurate, spiritually expressed account of a very long history. Not arrival, emergence, not displacement, transformation, not a story of 500 years, a story of 11,000 years. There is a Blackfoot elder named Clarence Wolfleg Sr. who, in an interview recorded in 2009, said something that I want to leave you with. He was talking about the land, about the specific hills and river bends of what is now southern Alberta, and he said, "My grandfather knew these places. His grandfather knew these places. Back and back and back, always the same people, always the same places." He did not know about ancient DNA. He did not know about haplogroup X or Y chromosome bottlenecks or the altithermal. He was not speaking as a scientist, but he was not wrong. Back and back and back, always the same people, always the same places. The science caught up to the story the Blackfoot had been telling all along. And here is the larger truth that every piece of evidence in this investigation points toward. Identity is not a fixed thing. It is not a blood percentage, or a haplogroup, or a linguistic category, or a legal definition. It is the living relationship between a people and their history. And history, as we now understand it, is longer and more complex and more layered than any single migration story can contain. The Blackfoot are not who we thought. They are something older, something more layered, something more resilient than the official version allowed. And if that is true of the Blackfoot, it is true of every people on this continent. Not one arrival, many arrivals. Not one origin, many origins. Not a simple story, a long one. Leave a comment right now. Which of these 6 discoveries hit hardest for you? Type the number 1 through 6 and tell me which part of this changed how you see this story. Was it the 1,200-year-old burial that matched modern Blackfoot DNA? Or was it the male lineage bottleneck, the genetic record of violence that every Blackfoot man carries silently in his Y chromosome? Those are my 2. I want to know yours. If you know someone who still believes the old version of this story, the simple migration, the recent arrival, the people defined only by their moment of destruction, send this to them. 1 send. That is all it takes to change how someone sees themselves and sees this land. Next time, there is a document sitting in a federal archive in Washington, D.C. It was written in 1873 by a U.S. Army surgeon who was conducting what he called a medical survey of the Blackfoot Reservation. What he recorded in that document, in clinical detached language, describes something that directly contradicts the official account of what happened during the starvation winter of 1883. This document was classified. It was declassified in 1994, and in the 45 years between its creation and its classification, several government reports cited its findings, but cited a version that had one critical paragraph removed. I will show you what that paragraph says, and I will show you what it means for everything we think we know about the deliberate destruction of the Blackfoot bison economy. They knew. The document proves it.